Bioscience and biotechnology advances are vital for fighting disease, protecting the environment, and promoting economic development. But these innovations can also pose risks of accidents or deliberate misuse. The next panel on architecture for biosafety and biosecurity discusses this and more. Our panelists for this session are Piers Millet, Executive Director, International Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative for Science; Jamie Yasif, Vice President, NTI Bio; Mrinmay Bhushan, Founder Director, Mindfarm Novatech Private Limited. The panel will be moderated by Shruti Sharma, Senior Research Analyst and Senior Convener, Global Technology Summit, Carnegie, India.
Thank you so much, Jamie, Mrinmay, and Piers, who's joined us virtually, for joining us for this discussion on architecture for biosafety and biosecurity. It is my pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. But before I start the discussion, I would actually like to turn to my audience, who's been sitting here for 2.5 long days. So because we're going to switch gears a little bit, we've heard a lot about digital technologies, crisis in Ukraine, all about geopolitics. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about bio-risks. So I want to turn to my audience and just conduct a quick poll to understand how many of you have some understanding of bio-risks. Can we please have your hands up? Okay, not a lot. Okay, and for those of you, I know some of the hands up are people who work in this space. So for others, was it just after COVID or was it before COVID? So after COVID, please raise your hands. Great. So I think basis this poll, what we're going to do is we are going to start with a moderated conversation, and we'll try and leave the last 10 minutes for audience questions. And I'm going to break this discussion into 4 parts. First is, just because not too many people in the audience know about biorisks a lot, so we will start with a very basic understanding of biorisks before we go into more technicalities of it. So the first portion of the discussion will focus on what are biorisks, why are they important, and why are they increasing? Second is, who is responsible for taking care of them? Is it the government? Is it the industry? Is it the scientific community or academia? Who is responsible for taking care of it? Third, there are some existing mechanisms to tackle these biothreats. Are they enough or are they lacking? And last and finally, we are going to be talking about where do we go from here. So just to kick this discussion off, I would turn to you, Jamie. So I'd like to ask, say, bioscience and biotechnology advances are vital for fighting diseases, protecting the environment, and promoting economic development. But these innovations also pose risks of accidents or deliberate misuse with potential of global catastrophe. So for the benefit of the audience, could you just tell us what are biorisks? Why are they increasing, and why is it important to take care of them?
Great, thank you so much, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion about biorisks in the context of the broader Global Technology Summit. It's a real pleasure to be here on this great panel and to see you all today. So I wanted to start by providing a little bit of context. So, we've been talking a lot over the last couple of days about the digital technology revolution and all the governance challenges that comes with that. Well, at the same time, we're experiencing in parallel across the globe is a 21st century biotechnology revolution. The scientific community and countries around the world is increasingly able to fundamentally engineer biological systems and living systems in ways to tinker with their properties, get living systems to perform all sorts of novel functions, engineer living systems from scratch. It's really, really tremendous developments that we're seeing. And examples of that, and that has tremendous potential upside benefit for building the bioeconomy. And this is something that, you mentioned economic development as a potential benefit. That's definitely true. The United States is very focused on building its bioeconomy. I understand that India as well, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a huge opportunity to move up the value chain and generate new sectors for growth. I'll offer some concrete examples of what I mean by this. So one thing we've been seeing over the last few decades is it's faster, cheaper, and easier to read, write, and edit DNA and RNA. So these are the blueprints of all living systems on Earth. We can do, and when I say read, write, and edit, I mean synthesizing DNA, sequencing DNA, and editing genomes using tools like CRISPR, which I imagine everyone has heard of. And if you look at the cost curves over time, you see basically exponentially decreasing costs over the years. And so, and this technology is being democratized. This is part of a larger phenomenon where we can, where these technologies are paired with advances in AI and automation, so we can bring to scale large-scale engineering of biological systems. So tremendous upside benefit, but it also carries risks. And some of the risks, to be concrete, you can use these technologies, for example, not only for beneficial applications, but also to tinker with living systems, make, for example, pathogens more virulent, more transmissible among human populations, or resistant to medical countermeasures like vaccines. And while there are a lot of legitimate reasons why the scientific research community is carrying out these kinds of experiments, there is a growing risk that this kind of capability can be exploited by malicious actors such as terrorist groups. And there's also a risk that if scientists are doing these kinds of experiments for legitimate reasons, there could be an accident. We know, we have data to see that accidents can happen in laboratories. People make mistakes. Facilities have failures, and so there is a risk of accidents that we have to think about, and to the extent that the pathogens that are released accidentally are more dangerous than perhaps a natural pathogen, then the potential danger of that accident is more severe. So this is really, this is very high stakes, and it's important. We've all lived through the COVID pandemic over the last 2.5, 3 years. We know that the stakes are high. Human lives are on the line in the millions and potentially more. Trillions of dollars in economic losses, political instability. We know that this could happen again. Next time, it might not be natural. It could be from the result of a deliberate misuse or accident. And so it's really critical for us to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. There's a tremendous upside benefit in terms of economic development, but the downside risks are significant.
No, thank you so much, Jamie, for that. I think is a wonderful explainer on biorisks. But before I turn to Mrinmay, I just wanted to ask one more question. So our panel is supposed to focus on biosafety and biosecurity. And I think it would be useful if you could just unpack the difference between biosafety and security, because if the definitions are clear, then it unpacks a lot of things and it clarifies a lot of things.
Absolutely, happy to. And yes, I think if we can sync up on what are the problems that we're trying to solve, and are we talking about the same problems, that will be more effective at identifying shared solutions. So I know that different people have different definitions for biosecurity, but I'll offer my definition when I think about it. So biosecurity is the set of tools and systems that you put in place to prevent deliberate misuse of bioscience and biotechnology to cause harm or bioweapons. Biosafety is the set of systems and tools that you put in place to prevent accidents and accidental misuse. So those are the definitions we use, and that's how we orient our work. But we recognize that preventing other types of risks is also critically important. We use other language to describe that.
Great. Mrinmay, I think before I ask you the question I wanted to ask, I would want to, Jamie has explained the difference between biosafety and biosecurity. Do you agree with that definition?
Yeah, of course, I do.
Okay, perfect. So that was a quick and simple answer.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So I think the COVID pandemic, as Jamie was suggesting, not only it led to a health crisis, but a political and an economic crisis, but it has also led to a surge in a large number of laboratories and, a surge in number of research when it comes to not just the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also other pandemics with pandemic potential. Labs have been set up in some of the countries which might not have robust safety and security regulations. So in such scenarios, like what kind of mechanisms can be established for, risk assessment? And if these experiments entail such risks, then in your opinion, is such research beneficial or is it just too risky?
To answer you simply, it's both. It's risky and it's beneficial. Such kind of research has to be conducted, of course, because, of course, we want to build our bioeconomies, right? So this kind of research is definitely necessary and beneficial, but at the same time, we have to weigh the risks. When we talk about risks, I remember some of you must have heard Yuval Noah Harari speaking at World Economic Forum in 2020. He had given out one simple equation, B plus C plus D is R. I hope somebody remembers that. What is this? We have been listening about computing and data for last 2 days. When you add biology to it or understanding of biological sciences to it, biological sciences plus computing plus data is ability to hack humans. That's B plus C plus D equal to R. That is the kind of risks that we are looking at. So that is the reason why this cost-benefit analysis has to be done while conducting all sorts of research, whether it's gain-of-function research or any emerging technology convergence-based research. And this needs to be governed by the respective governments. As we all know, when a certain research project is conducted, there is a lot of process of regulation that happens at each stage of developmental cycle of that project. And at each step of development of that project, there is some sort of regulation that happens from the government or research institutes, regulatory bodies. These are the points of that life cycle of that technology development. This is where this cost-benefit analysis has to be done, whether it is at the inception level or validation level or publication level, even before it all starts at the funding level. So all such points, this governance has to be there. So that is when you actually do the cost-benefit analysis. And when I say cost not necessarily only means the resources put in for that project. The governing authorities need to look at the cost which may be entailed if there is some accident, if there is misuse of that experiment, information regarding that experiment. All these aspects need to be considered while doing this cost-benefit analysis.
I think that's a very, very good point, Mrinmay. And before, so I think I'm going to pick from where you just left and just turn to Piers. So Piers, if I understand it correctly, and if what Mrinmay said is that just to contain risks, it is important to engage with stakeholders that are involved in every step of the development cycle. But, I just wanted to ask you, so there are two set of communities here, right? One is the scientific community who is more regularly engaged in research. And there is a security community that is more interested and that is more focused on tackling the dual-use implications of research. But usually these two communities don't talk to each other quite a lot. And in some cases, the scientists are unaware of the dual-use implications of their research. They are just ignorant. And in other cases, scientists might be aware of the dual-use implications, but are more worried that, oversight might just stifle research. So in the first scenario, what mechanisms could be established to ensure that there is communication between the scientific and the security community? And in the latter, how can we work with the scientific community to ensure that we develop governance mechanisms that does not stifle innovation, but tackle the risks?
Thank you very much for this question. I think a useful jumping off point is actually to unpack a little bit about that scientific life cycle, because it provides the opportunity to put deliberate reflection points in when coming up with the original ideas for research, when seeking research funding, when carrying out that research, and the internal oversight that happens inside laboratories and institutions around the world. And then again, whether that's going down a commercial route and looking for scale-up funding, or in stakes in intellectual property, or indeed whether it's an academic approach and the outcome is publishing. At every step, it's possible to have reflection points where scientists and engineers are able to take a step back and think about some of the broader implications of their work outside of the lab, and to really get involved with thinking about understanding and developing how that sits in our broader societies. That's not something we do right now. So in order to get to that space, we will need opportunities for education and awareness raising, and some of those will need to be formal. My original degree was in microbiology, and I can't remember a single lecture about the sorts of risks that we're talking about today. So maybe that's something we need to change. And then in addition, of course, there's the opportunities of using digital platforms and engagement tools to be able to empower and enable scientists to engage in some of these areas. And then almost once people start engaging, it's important to have the resources, capabilities, and support in place for the next generation of champions who can figure out how to balance these two competing interests, and to support them in doing that throughout their career. And that brings me around to incentives. Too often we talk about what the negative consequences could be for scientists or for institutions or companies. Not enough of the time, I think, we don't focus on how do we encourage engagement in some of these areas, whether it's unlocking additional funding or enabling professional opportunities, or indeed streamlining publication or commercial output for those that do engage in biosafety and biosecurity. I think the key to doing this is obviously the two communities you've mentioned have to find time to work together. They have to learn each other's languages. They have to find ways to work on joint projects together to become familiar and to break down some of those barriers and innate hesitancies to work together. I think where we need to get to is a view that working on biosafety and biosecurity is not about locking up or putting barriers in the path to innovation. Rather, it's exactly the opposite. It's about opening doors. It's about providing new opportunities and streamlining, being able to go from having a great idea to being able to have a real world impact with that great idea. I think at a basic level, pretty much all scientists and engineers, and certainly all the ones I've ever met, believe that their science and technology should be a beneficial thing. They got into science, they're doing their work because they want to make the world a better place. And we need to acknowledge that, and therefore scientists and engineers are and need to be treated as part of the solution here and not part of the problem, because I think fundamentally what we're moving towards is a cultural appreciation that good science and technology is safe, secure, and responsible science and technology. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I think, Piers, you've made a very interesting point that we should consider scientists as a part of a solution and not a problem. And I think some scientists in the room will be very happy hearing this. But thank you so much, Piers, for that wonderful explanation. And I think it's a good segue for me to turn back to you, Mrinmay. Piers has spoken about scientific community and the role and the need to bridge the gap between the scientific and the security community. But for some time now, governments have been playing a critical role in providing oversight to prevent the abuse and misuse of biological research. But they've struggled to keep pace with the advancements, right? With the rapid bioscience and biotechnology advances. So in your opinion, how can governments first keep up, and second, balance these biological risks and strengthen bioeconomy at the same time? Because it's important, right?
Absolutely. I talked about risks first, so let's talk about the benefits now and how to do it. So basically, taking cues from what you said and, of course, Pia said, the same thing. What needs to be done is bringing all these stakeholders on one platform. Because if we compare this landscape with, say, for example, nuclear technology, then in nuclear technology, there are just two stakeholders: civil nuclear energy domain and the military domain. Whereas when we look at the biological risk landscape, it's practically ubiquitous, right? So everybody is a stakeholder, starting from public and private research organizations, funding agencies, first responders, security agencies, research institutes, undergraduate students, universities, anybody and everybody is a stakeholder. We have seen it during COVID, right? So because of this complexity of this landscape, everybody should be on the board. But this is where the governments can play a very big role, because this is the way to build on bioeconomy. When you have very good biorisk governance structures in place, that is when the confidence can be built in this space. Dr. Jaishankar said yesterday, before yesterday, trust and transparency. These are the two keys for any confidence building, and this is what needs to be done by all the governments, especially G20. Now that today we are taking over G20, that's a right occasion to start over and start on the space, to work on the space rather. And this is where we should target to achieve our targets for bioeconomy capitalization as such. Most of us know that India has set a target of $300 billion in 2030 for bioeconomy. So let us build that confidence in this space so that we can capitalize on this bioeconomy.
Can I just chime in
Yeah,
on
yeah,
this?
sure, sure.
So I really appreciated your point, and I would emphasize that it's so important for governments to focus on this. I mean, I absolutely believe that we need an all-hands-on-deck approach for the reasons that you said, Mirami, where there's so many stakeholders, and really to have these effective intervention points throughout the life cycle that we've been talking about. We do need the academic research community, we need the funders, we need the publishers, we need them at the table, and we need to figure out how to prioritize, but governments are key to this. And I would offer as a statistic that we have a lot of work to do. In our research at NTI and with partners, we asked the question, how many governments around the world have publicly available evidence of national level oversight of dual use bioscience and biotechnology research and development? And it's a very disappointing result we got, which is 94% of countries do not have those kinds of mechanisms in place. So there's a lot of work to be done in countries around the world. Even countries that do have some of these tools in place have a lot of work to do. So I just would offer that much of the work we have is ahead of us, and I'm hoping that we can share best practices and replicable models so we can scale effective approaches in countries around the world.
Definitely. And if I could just make one more point and take your comment on it. So I think you mentioned about involving different stakeholders, right? Be it academia, industry, or whoever. But I think there's another layer to it, because biotechnology has got applications across different sectors. So it's not only bringing together stakeholders from, say, human health perspective. It's very important to get stakeholders from animal health or from plant health together, because so there are different types and different layers of collaborations that are needed to build a holistic framework when it comes to governing, biological research. So that was just my comment, but you can.
As you rightly pointed out, all these stakeholders need to talk to each other and understand each other's language and understand each other's challenges. That is when a common understanding will take place, that what exactly this animal is, called biorisk landscape. So that is how we can build further on this. I wanted to just add one more point to this. While building the bioeconomy, what is important is we constantly keep talking about dual-use technology and convergence of emerging technologies. But when we want that exchange to happen, technology transfer to happen, that is the reason why we need to have these biosecurity governance structures in place, which will build that trust factor within G20, so to say.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I would agree to that point. And I think Mrinmay has brought in a very good point on trust and transparency, but what governments need to do at a national level. But if I could turn to you, Jamie, to talk a little bit about, national governments are doing whatever they could to keep up with the growing advances. But there's a lot that's happening at international level as well. So could you tell us a little bit about the global architectures and if they are enough to handle or prevent accidental or deliberate risks?
Sure. So we've already talked about some of the gaps we're seeing at the national level, and I would say if we look globally, we have a similar story to tell. Basically, notwithstanding the critical importance of this work, there's no existing international organization that has the job or the primary mission of reducing emerging biological risks associated with rapid advances in science and technology. We know that the World Health Organization has a science and technology directorate. They have put out new guidance on governance of dual-use bioscience research, which is really a helpful and important step forward, and they're going to continue that work. Likewise, in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention, and in the upcoming review conference, the 9th review conference, which actually has started this week in parallel, and it'll be going on, there is increasing focus on questions about science and technology development and how that will shape the BWC going forward, both in terms of opportunities and risks. But neither of these organizations really have this as their top job. And so we see a significant gap in the global biosecurity architecture, and we see an opportunity to create a new organization, which I think peers will talk about in a couple minutes, to fill this gap and to sort of recognize that we don't have the luxury of time. We really need to accelerate progress and innovate in this area to solve the hard problems that we're talking about.
And Jamie, if I could just ask one more question on this. So you mentioned about the dual-use guidelines, you mentioned about the BWC. So all of this, if I understand it correctly, is more to deal with deliberate misuse. Is there an architecture available globally to handle accidents?
So I would say I think the work that the World Health Organization is doing and the BWC is doing, there isn't a clean line between biosafety and biosecurity. It's more like a Venn diagram, and there's a lot of overlap. Some of the things that you do to prevent catastrophic accidents are the same as what you would do to prevent deliberate misuse. So I would say they partially address biosafety. There also is I think the world of biosafety is much more established than the world of biosecurity. The work of biosafety is more clearly defined. It's been going on for decades. There are networks of biosafety officers and experts and long-lasting standard operating procedures. We know how to do biosafety. It's very clearly defined and crisp, I would say there. And so that infrastructure is much more developed. We are still trying to figure out what it means to operationalize biosecurity, and we're still building the standards of practice, trying to create tools for all these stakeholders we've been talking about so they can do this risk-benefit assessment at each stage throughout the bioscience and biotechnology research and development lifecycle. We don't have all those tools in place. We need to build them, and we need to innovate. So we need to build the tools, and we need to build the institution. So it's a bit different than the biosafety situation.
Great. And turning to you, Piers, I think Jamie and both Mrinmay have highlighted where the national and international architectures lack. So I would want to turn to you to talk about a little bit on independent international forums, right? Such as Ibis. So you've recently resumed a new role as the executive director for Ibis, and which is International Biosafety and Biosecurity Initiative for Science. So could you tell us a little bit on, why do we need such independent forums, and what can they do?
Absolutely. I think to sort of build off some of the comments you've just heard, first of all is the size of the challenge. We're just not going to have any single organization that can deal with all of the different facets of biosafety and biosecurity, with all of the different communities and stakeholders that can develop a single solution that will manage this risk globally. So we're going to need lots and lots of different forums, different organizations to help bring those folks together. Jamie mentioned the lack of a dedicated body to look at the emerging biorisks from advances in science and biological science and technology. That's what Ibis will be doing. Is filling that gap specifically and having somebody, an organization whose day-to-day job is to deliberately keep pace with trends in the science and technology, and to help bridge across to some of those international policy forums and standard setting organizations that you've just mentioned. I think each of those types of organizations have their own strengths and weaknesses, and having somebody that's looking at this on a continuing and ongoing basis as their primary mission will help to make sure that we take advantages of those strengths where they exist, and supplement areas where there are potential gaps or weaknesses. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is I've been involved in this field for a long time. I spent 12 years working for the Biological Weapons Convention. I've been consulting for WHO on these issues for about another 8 years. I think we know what we need to do. There are good ideas at the international level. There is broad support. But bridging that down to what do we actually do at the operational level? How do we turn this into actions, to procedures and practices that work in laboratories, that work in companies? That's a harder challenge, and also something that Ibis can help supplement as we get up to speed.
Great. And if I could just talk a little bit more about Ibis. So are there specific technologies or specific risks that Ibis is going to focus on? Like, what would be the priorities? And, what should be the priorities for these independent forums? Should it be, a more broader canvas, or should it be, a technology by technology and then involving stakeholders?
So the approach that we're going to take is certainly our first project is going to be very, very specific. We've talked a little bit about in this panel about the ability to read, write and edit DNA, genetic material. There are obviously potentially some risks that go with using genetic material and the many benefits that we will have out of those. So having a tool that allows you to understand what the risks of a given part of genetic material may be is important. Now, at the moment, there is no free, open, commonly available, high quality international tool that allows you to do that. So Ibis's first project will be putting that in place, making it available to everyone, everywhere, and reducing the barriers for scientists and engineers, whether they be in academia or industry or government or wherever they're working, to be able to better understand some of these biosafety and biosecurity risks associated with their work. Why does that need to happen in an international setting? Well, it's a fairly big jump. It doesn't exist anywhere, so we've got to build it. And that's a difficult thing for an intergovernmental organization to do. It requires a risk tolerance that is not common across the international architecture. So one of the things Ibis will be doing is de-risking some of these tools. Success in the case of that platform would be an intergovernmental organization sweeping in and saying, wow, this is useful, it's effective, we want to make this an official part of the work of whichever organization. And I think it's not about competing, it's about putting in some of the initial proof of principle work that will take some of these tools from off the drawing board and make them functional, help states and funders understand what it will cost, what it means, what the implications are, what it looks like, how to integrate it into their work. It's always better to have something that works in practice. So that's one key area for Ibis. Second priority, we've talked about the importance of bringing together different groups. That's not always easy, especially at the intergovernmental international level. It's sometimes tricky to bridge those public-private borders. There is a great sensitivity over a possibility of or perceptions of conflict of interest where commercial actors are involved in setting policy. That can be quite tricky to do. So having an independent international body to help work on that could be very useful. And certainly we have already started looking at areas of how we can work with funders and publishers to get that sort of whole of life cycle approach that I talked about previously. And then finally, there's things we can do to help build consensus around what it is we should be worried about and what we need to do about it. That is a giant task. I think everybody on this panel has hinted towards the fact that there's much work to be done in doing that. And again, having a space that focuses on this sort of bringing together the technical and policy communities in a way that we can start having shared views of what the challenge is and how we can work together will supplement what exists. So some thoughts on next steps.
This is actually a great explanation, Piers, and I'm glad to hear that you're not just focusing on, bridging that gap just between the security and the scientific community, but also involving other stakeholders as much. So it's not just the scientists, but also, educating and raising awareness amongst funders or among publishers, because I'll come back to the point that Minmay mentioned about transparency, because scientists, when they conduct a research, they want it to be certainly published, but it is up to the publisher to make sure that, to what extent should that be available in the open? Because there are technologies available, there are tools available that can just take information off the internet and manipulate things. There have been stories where people say that people can just manipulate everything sitting in a garage. So because of this increasing democratization and all of that, it is very, very important, and I'm very happy that, Ibis is going to look into this mission of kind of educating all the other stakeholders, funders, and publishers, including, to make sure that we tackle biorisks. But I think, Jimmy, you had a point to make? Okay, great. So I was actually coming to you, and, we've discussed a lot about the risks, right? And we have discussed what the national governments are doing, what is happening at an international level, where is the national government lacking, where the international scenario is lacking. And I think Piers has given us a good overview of Ibis and what independent forums could do. So just a very broad question to you, where do we go from here? Like, what is your broad solution to tackle biorisks?
Yeah, so I think, we've been working very closely with peers as we're working to incubate Ibis and spin it off, and I think we're really well aligned on our theory of change. We think we know, in terms of our strategy, we want to be very clear about what are the problems we're trying to solve and what's the relationship between the goals that we have and the actions that we're taking. And I think it ties back to this intervention points throughout the life cycle of bioscience and biotechnology research and development that we've been talking about. I think that's a very useful, concrete mental model to think about it comprehensively. And really the theory of change, I think it has like 3 pieces that's like at the base of it, in my view. So in terms of, fundamentally what you're trying to do is defend the legitimate global bioscience and biotechnology research and development apparatus from exploitation from malicious actors. And how do you do that? Well, you want to make sure that that malicious actors can't get the goods and the services, extract it from this system to use that to cause harm. And we also want to make sure that they can't get the tacit knowledge or the info hazard. So you were talking about publications. As the reason we care about publications is we want to make sure that the scientific publications and their aim of promoting science and knowledge and transparency aren't inadvertently creating a roadmap that would enable terrorists to create a more sophisticated biological weapon. So we have to think about how do we guard against exploitation of goods and services, and how do we safeguard knowledge and avoid info hazards. The third pillar ties back to accidents and the overlap between biosafety and biosecurity. And part of this is just these decision-making points earlier in the life cycle, thinking really carefully about, should this research go forward? Should this technology project go forward? If it does, are we going to create some sort of pathogen or other biological agent that's so dangerous that if it were accidentally released into the environment could cause a global catastrophe? So we need to think about that downside risk in advance and figure out, should we really go down this road? So that's the theory of change. And these interventions at the funding stage, oversight stage, goods and services, and publication, they're all designed to address those core principles. In terms of the way forward, we're really excited to see Ibis launching next year. We're delighted that Piers has stepped into the role of inaugural executive director. He's just got the right skills and experience to tackle this, so we're really excited. Ibis is going to go forward with launching this common mechanism for DNA synthesis screening. We've been working over a number of years to get this ready for prime time. And then we're going to continue to work in the background to develop other tools to address these other points and offer it to Ibis to try to scale it up at a global level. It's not, as Piers mentioned, we have to figure out what are we worried about, like what is okay, what are the rules of the road for bioscience and biotechnology, and that's not a trivial question to answer. If you're, for example, a funder, you need to decide, okay, this dual-use research project, am I balancing benefits and risks correctly when I decide whether it moves forward? Well, we need better guidelines to help funders make that decision more effectively. We need better guidelines for publishers to make that decision. So we're going to continue to work to develop tools in that arena. And I would just say, today's a really auspicious day to be having this conversation. It's the first day of India's presidency of the G20. I'm sure people have been saying that all day. And I'm really hopeful that this set of issues will be on the agenda for the G20 discussions over the next year. I think India has a tremendous opportunity to take a leadership role in shaping this and leading an international conversation about this.
So, Jamie, I think you've mentioned the G20. I was going to leave this question to the end, but so let me turn to you, Piers, first, and just ask you. As Jamie said, today is the first day of India's G20 presidency. If you were to say one of the priorities for India in its G20 presidency to tackle biorisks, what would that be?
Is as fundamental as to add the discussion of biosafety and biosecurity into the broader discussion of the bioeconomy. The G20 is originally an economic forum. All of the members of the G20 have national strategies about how to build their bioeconomy. I looked at the numbers for India. Currently sits about $30 billion a year. It's estimated within the next sort of 7 years to go up to about $300 billion a year. At the moment, there just isn't enough focus on reflecting on how to maximize the benefits whilst minimizing the risks. I think adding that flavor into the bioeconomy discussions could be a huge change and a really, really important thing for India to do. Thanks.
Piers, that's a great way of packaging a complicated problem into a simple sentence. Turning to you, Mrinmay, what would be your take on it? What should be India's priority when it comes to G20?
As often mentioned that we are assuming presidency today. But today we as a world, we are standing at a position where we have just come out of or still coming out of COVID-19. We are seeing tremendous challenges as far as geopolitics is concerned. And in this highly polarized world, we are trying to deal with many biological risks as well. So with this background, I believe when India is assuming this presidency today with the mantra of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it is one earth, one family, and one future. So looking at it futuristically, India should ideally take leadership position as far as Piers said, building the bioeconomy for G20 by building the biorisk governance infrastructure as such, our governance models as such. I would be really happy if India takes the leadership position in this. Thank you.
Great. Jamie.
So there's, I would echo what has already been said. I would say, I think basically raising the bar globally for biosafety and biosecurity. So thinking concretely about some of the challenges and solutions we're putting on the table, having a global conversation and stating explicitly that we need to raise the bar across countries, because fundamentally, if there's no one country can tackle this on their own. That's why this has to be a global conversation. If there's significant biosecurity gaps and biotechnology governance gaps in any one country, in any one region, then we're all vulnerable. Fundamentally, these biological agents don't respect borders. If there's a catastrophic accident or a bioweapons attack, heaven forbid, in one country or one region, and we can't prevent it, then we're all going to be vulnerable. And in fact, the countries that have the weakest detection and response systems are probably the most vulnerable to the impact. So I think both the global north and the global south have a shared stake in this work. And so I think I'm really excited and hopeful that the G20 will tackle this under India's leadership.
Great. And on this note, we have about 9 minutes. So I'll turn to the audience. If anyone has a question, there are 2 mics in the 2 corners. Please come against the mic and please introduce yourself and keep your questions brief. Thanks. Can we have the mic turned on, please?
Hi. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting discussion. Actually, Jamie, you set me
Could
up
you
for my
please
question.
introduce yourself?
So sorry, I'm Keshav. I work with Carnegie. Jamie, you set me up perfectly for my question. So in the context of the pandemic, we realized that the possibility of, say, a lab leak or a malicious actor releasing, say, a pathogen could have very devastating consequences for all of us. In that context, the requirement of having significant cross-national surveillance networks, or perhaps observatories of some sort across the world, becomes very important. So my question is, in that context, what do you do when a country either A, does not have the resources to set up that kind of domestic network, or B, just refuses outright to share information or share data? What happens in that context? Thank you.
Is this question directed at me? Okay.
Yeah, you appear
Okay.
either one.
Well, so it's a very easy problem that you're posing to me. Thank you. So I think. So I would say, so first I want to offer the caveat. I think biosurveillance is tremendously important. I've thought about it in the past. It's not my day-to-day focus, but I'll offer my thoughts nonetheless. I do think, for the reasons that you're stating, it's really critical to have networked biosurveillance capabilities, not just in individual countries, but across regions. And we need to recognize that not all countries will have the resources to build their systems. And so actually, one of the, I think, lessons that is coming out of COVID is that it's critical that as a global community that the countries with resources do have to invest in lasting pandemic preparedness capabilities, not only within their own borders, but to help other countries, including lower and middle income countries. And in fact, the World Bank, with G20 leadership, recently established the new financial intermediary fund that's focused specifically on this task. And they're looking to make investments in high impact investments in lower and middle income countries to tackle this global commons problem. So I think what we have a responsibility as a global community to identify the greatest weaknesses and gaps and make sure that we dedicate resources to go plug those gaps so that we can, because fundamentally if there are countries that have weak biosurveillance systems, we're all vulnerable. That's why it's worth the investment. The data transparency piece is critical. I mean, certainly it is a requirement under the international health regulations for countries to share data with the World Health Organization and be transparent if there's something going on within their borders. That's just a legal requirement. We know that sometimes that doesn't work as well in practice as we would ideally like. It's certainly challenging. I'm not going to name names, but I think I know the implication of your question. I think the best that we can do is have really strong norms and incentive structures. We need to do a better job incentivizing countries to share data about what's going on within the borders and not penalize them economically if they're the ones to be transparent first. And then and that's the carrot, we also need to have a stick. And if countries are not in compliance with international norms and expectations, are not being transparent, there should be consequences. They should be held accountable.
Piers, Mrinmay, would you like to add anything to it? Piers, anything?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think firstly, the optimistic piece is that this is to some extent a technology problem. We are taking tools and technologies on surveillance, especially sort of next-gen sequencing-based approaches that were developed for lab use. We've not scaled those. We've not pushed the price points down. We could see future surveillance systems using different types of technology platforms that are orders of magnitude simpler and cheaper to use than the ones that we've traditionally had. So that may mean we can put them in more places and run them on a more continuous basis than we've ever been able to do before. And the second piece, to deal specifically with this issue of transparency, there's an opportunity here potentially to change one of our greatest weaknesses into a potential strength, which is the amount of international travel that we have is often mentioned as a concern about how fast diseases can spread around the world. Also gives us the opportunity to put the sorts of disease surveillance technologies that I was talking about into major transport hubs, and then you start seeing what the normal is and what the unusual is when we spot the unusual compared to the normal. Even if countries don't want to make that information available, they do want their people to be able to travel around the world. And so we can start getting insights into some of those closed boxes using some of those technologies.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dirk van der Klee from the Australian National University. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Hugely, hugely informative to me. I think my question is for Jamie, but for Piers as well. It tags on from the previous question. You talked about interventions at each stage of the life cycle. How do you intend to, I don't know, enforce or incentivise or operationalise these interventions? Because, of course, we're talking about economies that are competing to get their slice of the bioeconomy pie. How do you intend to try and get enforcement, I guess, of those interventions?
Great, thank you. I think, I think incentive structures are critical, and I think certainly competitiveness is part of the equation, but so is collaboration and enlightened self-interest. So, for example, if you think about the funders, I mean, certainly already some governments have put in place protocols for reviewing research, because I don't think any funder has an interest in funding the next research project that leads to a global catastrophe or a bioweapons attack, right? And so there's a basic understanding there, and I think certainly that's also true for philanthropic organizations. If you think about industry, I think that's a really interesting and helpful example here. So we have been working with, in order to develop this common mechanism for DNA synthesis screening, we've been working very closely with industry partners. They volunteer and show up at our meetings and help advise us as we shape and scope this work. And then they have, they're working for mostly for-profit companies. Why do they show up? Because they feel that it's in their enlightened self-interest to do effective DNA synthesis screening, because they don't want to sell DNA to the next bioterrorist or create the next catastrophe. They know that if something terrible goes wrong, it could kill their company, it could kill their industry. And so it's enlightened self-interest, and I think that could carry across other companies as well. And in terms of publishers, I think, again, for them, it's a similar issue, is they want to do the right thing. They don't have anything to gain by being irresponsible. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to get the greatest paper out there, get a lot of attention, democratize science. And publishers have already made public statements in large groups that they want to do a better job doing pre-publication biosecurity review. I mean, I honestly think that one of the best incentives we can offer these groups is by giving them tools, making it easier for them, because it costs money, it takes time and expertise to do screening. They need better guidelines about what kind of questions they should answer, what are the criteria for something passing or failing, can they call an expert to help advise them if they get stuck. So I think we should view them as allies, and by providing them with tools and resources to make it easier to do the right thing, I think that goes a long way towards creating incentive structures. It's a similar model to the one we've been using with DNA synthesis screening. The last thing I'll say is, for the funders, just going back to that, we're thinking about a biosecurity funders compact as one of the new pilot projects that we're trying to boot up as a sort of gift basket to Ibis. And the idea is we would love to get funders, both public and private, to come to the table and make a public pledge and a commitment to strengthen their biosecurity practices. And then that gives them, I think, positive brand value. It makes them look like responsible stakeholders in the community. And if then, as a reward for that participation, we work with them to develop tools to make it easier for them to do the review. So that's our approach in general. It's obviously experimental, so we hope it's successful, but that's how we hope to complement the efforts of government.
Great. And with that, I would like to bring this discussion to a close. We are right on time, and thank you so much, Jamie, Mrinmay, and Piers, for joining this discussion, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.